Huh, well, look at that. Only thing that happened before this was Resident Evil 4. But part of this story happens a little before that. And before that, the new movie that takes place in 2006 has a significant event that will surely be relevant later to our story. It was back in the year 2000 called the Panamistan Civil War. It was a conflict which took place in Panamistan on October 2000 and saw one of the first uses of progenitor-derived bioweaponry in a war zone. Okay, so it's 2010.
Listen, someone's stomach, child's stomach just growled.
And you're on a version of YouTube that doesn't suck, watching an announcement for your Nintendo 3DS. Capcom has just unveiled a new Resident Evil game slated for 2011, and honestly, it looks pretty good. You're actually kinda blown away at the graphical fidelity on what's essentially half of a Wii. Upon further inspection, you find out it's just a full-price game with one mode you kinda played in RE4 to get a gun that pounded enemies harder than you've ever pounded a pussy. I wasn't sure of what the female equivalent of this analogy was, so I had to ask a friend.
You're like a real girl, right? Okay, so here's a question.
What?
What is the female equivalent of pounding pussy?
What?
By the end of the trailer, your excitement had quelled to a whimper, since you weren't really getting a new mainline game. You buy Ocarina of Time 3D instead to fill the void. But in that same year, Capcom makes another announcement. It's another Resident Evil game. And this time, it's the real deal. Another whole-ass game with these wacky characters we've learned to call a family. Entirely on the 3DS. It also looked quite good. Jill looked good, some other chick had half of her ass hanging out of a wetsuit, and it seemed like it was going to lean towards classic survival horror, something sorely missed by fans after the last game released 2 years ago. It was slated for early 2012. You buy another copy of Ocarina of Time 3D to fill the void. Come January, it was time to see if the 3DS was up to the task.
Like, dick appointment.
They say dick appointment?
Yeah.
Made with an altered version of the MTF framework, Revelations is one of the most technically impressive games on the 3DS. Good graphics were a primary focus for the team, and it definitely shows here as a lot of the planning went into optimizing the game for the system. For example, the design of the ooze being gray semi-amorphous blobs were utilized since it didn't require much texture work or complex skeletal physics, meaning more of them could be active on screen at once, and the 3DS could have more resources free for the environment and primary character models. The scale of each individual section was reduced, and how the game handled loading these portions was also altered from previous titles to ensure little details in the environments didn't have to be sacrificed to a high degree. The areas with a lot of clutter, such as Terra Grigia, are often sectioned off into smaller rooms, while wider spaces rely on more natural environments to make up for how much less is going on. Seeing the 3DS version scaled up, as you are now, the crude details are far more apparent, but trust me when I say, it's a sharp-looking title on its native hardware. So the visuals are up to spec, but how about the story?
Think these things got to Chris and Jessica?
I hope not.
Reminder that I'm probably one of the worst people you will ever listen to trying to explain a game's story, and I'm on record saying I don't very much care. Unless it's really stupid, or anime. But Revelations has a lot of shit going on narratively, and we're simply switching between protagonists too much in the main game for me to leave it out. We're following the team of Jill and Parker on the Queen Zenobia for the primary story, the team of Chris and Jessica in the mountains, the team of Quint and Keith, also in the mountains, and the team of Parker and Jessica for a flashback segment. Where every other Resident Evil was content to have the story play out for a single team of two, we've decided now, on the Nintendo 3DS, to start jumping between an ensemble cast. Maybe it was a test drive for things to come later that year? But who's to say? So if I have this right, the whole story hinges on Terra Grigia. Okay, I know that Terra means Earth, but what does Grigia mean? Alright. The whole story hinges on Terra Grigia and what happened to it in the spring of 2004. A bunch of bioweapons attack the place, and in order to keep the surrounding area safe, the city has to be destroyed by a super satellite in space. At the time, two agencies are at the forefront of handling bioterror. the FBC headed by one Morgan Lansdale, and the BSAA headed by one Clive O'Brien. Now at this time, Morgan wants more funding for the FBC since they believe rightly so that bioterror is a world top priority issue. So in order to stimulate some stimulus checks from the government, Morgan conspired with the terrorist organization Veltro, headed by one Jack Norman, to fuck over Terra Grigia to prove that his organization is woefully underfunded. He did this by providing Norman with the T-Abyss virus that came from Tricell, some UAV equipment, and 3 cruise ships, the Queen Zenobia, the Queen Samaris, and the Queen Dido. The attack on the city is successful, and the FBC members in attendance are unable to stop the assault as predicted. It takes a space satellite nuking the place's entire existence to ensure the bioweapons don't spread. Morgan then fucks over Norman by cutting all ties with him and sinking his primary ship of operation, the Queen Dido, while he's still on it. O'Brien, who's also there during the attack on the city, is insanely suspicious that Morgan orchestrated the whole thing, so he begins scheming on how to prove it. This puts us in 2005. The FBC is now the leading agency on bioterror. Don't think anything says this conclusively, I'm just going on the fact that Morgan's agency seemed to outrank the BSAA in the main story. O'Brien, now with a master plan to reveal Morgan as the culprit of Terra Grigia's demise, has revived Veltro in a shell form. I think he has this guy gather up some Veltro stragglers to create a shell of a credible threat. Now this in theory creates a reason for the BSAA to investigate out and about without the FBC thinking any the wiser. Even if the FBC was dispatched along the BSAA, lower level operatives wouldn't be informed that Morgan essentially fucked the city, so anything any of them find connecting Morgan to the attack would be a net win for the BSAA. Unless Morgan was smart enough to dispatch an FBC member completely in the know to destroy the evidence. Or, just immediately destroy the evidence after the attacks. Don't see why he couldn't just hire some mercenaries, low-key team up with another terrorist group. I mean, why not? You definitely had the time. So, O'Brien sends Chris and Jessica, a mole printed by Tricell to ensure their ties are cut with Morgan when he's eventually caught, but also acting as a mole for Morgan on the BSAA to destroy evidence, after some answers as to why Veltro has returned, off in the bumfuck mountains. He then claims to lose their signal, somewhere in the Mediterranean, where one of the 3 ships used in the assault are currently located. Okay, whatever. He sends Jill and Parker there to investigate the whereabouts of Chris and why the signal was lost. Only they're not really there to find Chris, he still knows exactly where he is. He just wants Jill to find evidence that Morgan was tied to Veltro a year ago. This is roughly the same time that FBC agents Honkers and Rayman, all in the FBC planted by O'Brien that also likely works for Tricell, are sent to the same ship, because the FBC is also a bioterrorist organization, which has to respond to claims of bioterrorism, aka some guy making up claims that Veltro has returned. Back to the mountains, Chris and Jessica investigate a plane crash near an airbase, which was apparently a base of operations for Veltro. After fighting off some infected dogs and finding the airbase itself, they tag out with Quint and Keith. They then head out to the Mediterranean because O'Brien has lost contact with Jill and Parker. For reals this time. They head out to the Queen Samaris thinking it's the Queen Zenobia because we need this drowning sequence to shock the audience. They then correct course and get to the actual ship they need to get to. Meanwhile, Quint and Keith essentially find some evidence which help tie Morgan to Terra Grigia, but it also ties O'Brien with Veltro number 2. Their role in the story is now over. Jessica and Chris find Parker and Jill swap teammates and split up since at this point, Jill has found evidence that the Zenobia will release T-Abyss into the ocean, and they need to stop it. Parker attempts to get back into contact with O'Brien but is shot since Jessica is basically there to ensure Tricell doesn't take the fall. And her coming out as a mole for old Morgan definitely helps that goal. Raymond helps Parker escape, gets dinner with Jessica, who also escaped, and is never heard from in the franchise again. Chris and Jill stop T-Abyss from spreading and conclusively hear from Morgan's mouth that he's the culprit. The Earth is saved since our giant monster is defeated, and the virus has been neutralized. But we still don't have enough damning evidence to put Morgan behind bars. So Chris and Jill head to the Queen Dido, find Jack Norman, who survived the entire time under the ocean for nearly a year through injecting himself with T-Abyss. Right. And then kill him for his T-Mobile sidekick, which has the damning evidence needed to place Morgan as a conspirator with the terrorists. They escape the ship, Morgan goes to jail, and then Chris and Jill go off for some Resident Evil 5 DLC to set up events for the next game. There's absolutely more to it than this, but fuck it. Narratively, this is why the game will be swapping between 4 teams throughout the campaign, for worse and for worse. But we'll get to backing that assertion later. Before we get into the main campaign, let's talk about the main 2 versions of the game. The original released on the 3DS, and the revision released for 7th generation consoles that got ported over for newer systems since then. With the advent of the port and its many improvements, it'd be hard to recommend playing the original version over its HD counterpart. But the handheld version has a few things going on for it that the port can't quite claim for itself. The first is the addition of first-person aiming, likely added due to the smaller screen size of the 3DS, and a way to help accentuate the 3D effects. Playing over the shoulder like normal functions perfectly fine, but some people may prefer this style of shooting given the conditions. No idea why they excluded it from the port since they already had it coded in and working, unless they just felt it was an unnecessary feature for a more conventional setup. The next items stem from the 3DS touchscreen, the big 2 being weapon selection and puzzle interface. Cycling through weapons on the 3DS can be done with either the touch UI or the D-pad, while the port only has the D-pad for switching. This is mostly a superficial change since the 3 weapon limit means you can access all weapons with one cycle through your arsenal, but with 4 grenades you may have to cycle twice through your inventory before getting to what you want. This is as opposed to the touchscreen, which will allow for exactly what you want with a single touch. In raid mode, the port tries to get around this by always starting you off with the same type of grenade every time so you can quickly cycle to what you want with the same number of presses. This is a change from the 3DS, which remembered what sub-weapon you had equipped in between raids. It's a slight advantage for the touchscreen controls, but only very slight. The screwdriver puzzles in the main game swap from being touch activated to pointer controlled. These go much faster on the 3DS, and the action of using your stylus to rearrange the wires line up with what Jill is doing on screen. Besides that, the change is also mostly superficial, and you're functionally doing the same thing. The next of the differences in the 3DS's favor pertain to some aspects of the game's multiplayer. The port loses the novelty of the 3DS Street Pass function, and instead has special monsters assigned purely by way of playing with others. You're essentially getting the same functionality here, but you're losing the ability to get a target by just walking near somebody else with a 3DS. The game's final stage is also far better for farming special equipment, since endpoints are scattered all throughout the level, versus the port which only has a single point of exit. You may actually see these endpoints as a detriment if you're just trying to play the stage, and wind up being paired with a person just trying to farm. Likely why they backtracked the idea for the port. But if we're talking about getting the game's best custom weapon parts quickly, the 3DS is definitely the less grindy option. Another advantage for 3DS multiplayer is that it surprisingly still exists, until Nintendo shuts down the online. I can only state myself anecdotally for the copies that I own, but between the PC, the Wii U, and the 3DS is the most consistent for finding random strangers to play with, even to this day. I hopped online recently between all 3, and the 3DS was the only one to find matches first try on more than one occasion. You might think it's a little unfair to include the Wii U, but folks are literally still playing Smash 4 on the motherfucker. The ports require far more searching to get even a single match going, and honestly I've only gotten to play the multiplayer for the ports by arranging matches. The 3DS version still has games to be found, but the caveat is that all the remaining people playing this version really like to play this game, and if it's your first time, you're probably going to get left behind. The last advantage the 3DS version has over the ports is the limited print of the typo cases, and the fact that you may be sitting on some money if you picked up one of those. Could come in handy when your car gets repoed. For the majority of folks who probably won't seek out a handheld console from forever ago and or deal with a bad PC emulated experience, you'll likely be experiencing this game through the HD re-release, and it has a pretty good list of improvements, the majority pertaining to the multiplayer, but a few for other areas. The first are the baseline differences that come from leaving the 3DS. You have improved visuals, models, and better overall performance, at least for the PC and 8th generation consoles onward. The port also has a more natural control scheme that more people are probably used to. You could get a Circlepad Pro for the 3DS to re-implement the normal third-person RV control scheme, but here that's the baseline. The knife has its own hot button, meaning that you have one less thing to switch between, whereas on the 3DS the knife was traded out with grenades. The campaign and multiplayer add a new enemy type that builds its own combat niche completely different from the other established enemies. I don't even know how this enemy works! No! Is this a one-hit KO? Parker! Save me! Parker! And you have the added ability to shoot down this box projectile weapon, moving it more in line with RE4 and 5. You no longer have to take a monster cock in your monster ass. The remainder of the port revisions come from the multiplayer overhaul, which is a damn shame being the harder version of the game to find a match. The first and least significant of these changes come from the overall increased difficulty of raid mode itself. Enemy spawns have been slightly tweaked, and some of the 3DS camping strategies such as hanging out in the elevator to kill the dogs and using the single points of entry on the deck for the ghost ship were nerfed. A new one-hit kill enemy type was added, and the damage you deal has been modified from the 3DS with the same custom parts due to the inclusion of the extra method to buff weapons. This is eventually balanced out with some changes from our next category, the flat-out new additions. New to raid mode this time around are these special weapons with certain properties to them. Some are faster to reload, some do more damage based on distance, some have lower recoil, some increase movement speed, some make melee damage higher, or increase all weapon stats at the cost of movement. I like the idea of each weapon housing these properties conceptually, but all it means is more grinding to make sure you get the right kind of weapon with the right kind of buff on top of the right custom parts. Speaking of custom parts, there's a higher list of them this time around. The majority of the effects fall in line with what the 3DS had on offer, such as having some damage boosting items to specific enemy types, or finding more of certain items. Some returning parts have had their effects buffed with higher numbers. For instance, the damage mod formerly capped out at 6 for the 3DS, but now caps out at 7 for the port. The one I appreciate the most is the custom part which re-implements what was likely a bug on the 3DS, the level adjuster. Formerly on the 3DS, if you were using a level 50 weapon as a lower level, like level 1, you still hit like a truck. The calculations made to reduce weapon damage simply didn't reduce power severely enough to seriously impact your damage output. I was able to hang around as a level 1 character until some ways into the trench difficulty, and with all of my swagged out weapons it was possible for me to complete the entirety of the ghost ship raid as low as level 40, 10 levels under the maximum. The port corrected the damage calculation, making your weapons line up with what the performance would actually be at lower levels, making low level runs much harder, and the level adjuster just semi-restores the old calculations that made low level runs busted in the first place. And honestly, it's one of the most creative ways I've seen a game handle an adjustment patch. Rather than just deem overpowered low-level guns a flat-out mistake to correct, they made it a feature to unlock for running out your bonus awards if you weren't inclined to earn them along the first time. Also newly added are the permanent weapon boost items, which help make your damage output more in line with the 3DS. You can permanently buff damage, fire rate, and capacity without taking custom part slots. They can stack up to 30 times per weapon and be mixed and matched how you please. They do cost a high price, but by the late game your earning potential will outpace your spending. Honestly, these just give you some more use for BP in general and validate the BP collecting custom parts, since you'll likely want multiple weapons that are fully boosted with different buff combinations. Towards the end of raid mode on the 3DS, I had already bought all the basic upgrades for health, ammo capacity, and damage reduction, so the only thing I spent my money on was restocking ammo. But even then, I easily hit the max money cap by just playing another raid. The boosters add yet another layer to the weapon grinding, but at least allows for some more customization and use for BP. On top of weapons with special properties and weapon boosts are new rare weapon types. Before, out of the 5 classes, you only had one rare weapon for the shotgun, rifle, magnum, and machine gun. The port adds not only a rare variant for the pistol, which was left out last time, but adds a rare variant for every version of every gun per class, all 20 of them. And that includes the original rare weapons. So not only can you get the Drake, which is the rare shotgun, you can get the Lindworm, which is the rare version of the rare gun. Like the other new additions, this adds another layer to the weapon grinding game. And if you're looking for the rare gun with the right stat buff, you're going to be grinding drops for a while. Thankfully, the last new addition the port adds to raid mode doesn't also add to the grind, that being the new unlockable costumes. Some characters get a wacky outfit, and some characters who weren't playable before become playable, and some offbeat choices and decisions join the roster as well. It's just a shame that some characters like Morgan, Norman, and O'Brien still only get one outfit while others get 3, but in the same vein, these probably weren't super popular characters. You'll just have to look at the same shit you were looking at on the 3DS if you prefer their character buffs. The last category of changes the port makes compared to the 3DS I would classify as little tweaks. It's not new content, just stuff that could have been done better on the game's first outing, and all these still pertain to raid mode. Firstly is the ability for 2 characters to walk through the same door. I assume characters open doors the way they did on the 3DS for technical reasons, but you always had to let it slam in your face when following somebody. Just being able to follow a brother smooths out the co-op more than I expected it to, as walking through doors is a pretty big part of certain raids. I got used to just having things slam in my face, but now it's one of the hardest things to go back to when playing the original version. Second is the game asking you to sell all custom parts right off the rip after a raid. The UI could definitely be faster, maybe just showing all the custom parts at once and allowing you to tag things to keep or sell, but other than that, it front loads what you used to spend doing on the back end. Next are the changes to the bonus system and what counts towards extra credit. On the 3DS, you got bonus BP added for not taking damage, killing all the enemies, and not missing a single shot. That last one being one of the most frustrating things to land, especially on the 3DS. The port swaps out the accuracy bonus for a low level bonus, meaning you must be equal to or lower than the stage's recommended level. A much more sensible ask, since some raids like Ghost Ship can take up to an hour to genocide, and missing even a single shot will kill one of your bonuses. The most useful change to the bonus system comes from the custom parts rewarded for achieving all 3 bonuses in a single stage on the Abyss difficulty. A lot of changes made in the port have been adding to the grind, but giving you a legendary custom part that were formerly acquired through Street Pass RNG is a welcomed inclusion. It incentivizes full level playthrough since you're getting a highly useful tangible reward, and because the legendary parts given are fixed to each stage, you can farm for exactly what you need. The RNG farming on the 3DS wasn't terrible since you could run Ghost Ship in as fast as 10 seconds, but this change completely eliminates the luck factor. I can only imagine how frustrating farming would be if the accuracy bonus was still intact for the HD version. The port actually lets you flat out buy some legendary custom parts, which is a welcome change, but all of them don't appear in the store, and they are kinda steep in price, so they'll likely conflict with your booster buying initially. Lastly is the addition of BP medals hidden throughout each raid, in which some will trigger enemy spawns. They help you accrue capital faster for the purchases you'll need to make, and it allows you to set up for an enemy encounter since you're in control of when you activate the spawn. So a pretty solid inclusion. All in all, the port definitely has a more robust version of the 3DS's base multiplayer. Far more grindy since there's a lot more RNG involved, but definitely the version I'd rather play.
It's been 94 minutes since Chris and Jessica dropped off the radar.
But the interpolation from their last known coordinates puts them...
Right here on this ship.
Before we get going on the main campaign, let's cover the changes to the game's controls. See, we've finally realized that the dual analog setup isn't going anywhere, and it's pretty much cemented itself as the universal default for any type of shooter. We have realized this now. On the Nintendo 3DS, the system which doesn't have 2 sticks without a peripheral. You'd think that the control scheme in Revelations would have come like one game earlier with Resident Evil 5, but like, nah, we're good. Jabbing aside, the movement here is the best in the series thus far, at least for the port. The tank controls which were only implemented to combat the environment of the fixed camera have been stripped out. And Jill can finally maneuver with the dual analog control scheme that the vast majority of other shooters have adopted at this point. The series has been shifting to a far more action-oriented affair, and the control scheme implemented here makes much more sense. One stick just moves Jill in whatever direction you need her to go regardless of where she's facing, and the other will just steer her sight. Because Revelations is still going for the horror atmosphere, Jill won't be running as fluidly as her first-person shooter counterparts. Any direction she attempts to move that she isn't facing will result in her slowly walking, keeping her from being too agile for the enemies on offer. Besides this switch from the tank controls, she essentially handles like the protagonist in Resident Evil 4 and 5, save the ability to move while shooting. The HD port allows the knife to be accessed instantly from hitting the right trigger without aiming, and it feels so natural it's honestly a little crazy it took this long for this change to be implemented. Way more fluid than having to draw a knife first or having to take up some kind of weapon or sub-weapon slot. On the game's initial release, however, you needed a peripheral called the Circle Pad Pro in order to get the game's intended dual analog control scheme to feel the most natural. The new 3DS models with the smaller second analog built in also works, but it's probably the clunkiest implementation of that control scheme. I chose to play the game using the face buttons on the right side of the console as my second stick. Also, a very clunky way to play, but over time I became skilled at letting up Jill well enough with the left stick and making smaller tweaks with the buttons. PC players will of course get to utilize the mouse and keyboard for more effective aiming as well as the standard dual analog controller. Like the two games before, we're going to be taking things on a chapter system. We've got a total of 12, but including each chapter subsection, we have a total of 26 segments to play through. And by going through this campaign, we'll essentially be covering the layouts of the game's multiplayer as well. Raid mode is essentially just the main story beats while stripping out the cutscenes, dialogue, and scripted events, then adding in more enemy spawns. For example, Chapter 1-1 is just walking to the kitchen while the environment makes scary noises at us and teases combat. We then kill a single enemy, laugh in its face, then watch a pretty lengthy set of cutscenes which will clock in at about 3.5 minutes combined. Longer than it actually takes to complete the first segment of gameplay if you don't spend some time exploring. The first raid is essentially the exact same segment of gameplay. You start from the same position on the outside of the ship, then make your way into the kitchen, fighting more enemies along the way, before the bukkake in the cook room. I am so proud of myself I didn't call it the cock room. By the time I get to talking about the multiplayer, there really will not be much to say on the game's stages, since they essentially just reflect what you do in the main campaign. There are only a few sections in the campaign, like the area past the Trident Door, the Underwater Bilge, and the Queen Dido prior to the final boss, not used in the game's raid mode. Part 2 of Chapter 1 is a slower paced version of the second raid. Get used to hearing this sentence in one form or another, by the way. It properly introduces the Genesis device and the concept of scanning enough enemies to fill a meter. You can completely ignore it on lower difficulties, though on higher ones it proves a more useful tool since health items are in shorter supply. Besides creating more health, it can be used to track hidden handprints, though that's really just to unlock some bonus rewards. It's no Metroid Prime scanner that gives you a detailed look at the enemy's sexual history, but it's a harmless addition to the gameplay. One that doesn't slow things down since it can be set to the side and gives the player more incentive to explore the world. Besides scanning, there's a few globsters to kill, slow tanky enemies which weirdly don't appear in any other raid mode stage besides this beach and ghost ship. Every other enemy type, save the final boss, show up in droves over the fucking place. Fish, swordsman, Al-Qaeda, Rachel, especially Rachel, but these things are confined to this spot in the final section of the main campaign. They have the potential to one-hit KO you, but so do a few of the other enemies. They're easily the most underutilized asset in the entire game. 1-3, so we end up finding Chris, who's really a dummy. Raimi Hunt's planning to ambush Jill and Parker right off the bat, without having to blow up a mansion, a city, an entire island, or the country of Spain. Come to think of it, it's kind of like a mixed bag on whether or not our protagonist will find who we're looking for in the game. The mansion incident took the whole game to get the Chris. The police station has you teaming up with your retrospective escort middle of the road. Respective? Retrospective? Fuck ever. You probably fuck Carlos at some point when you find him behind Denny's in the beginning of RE3, and she didn't even know she was looking for him. Claire's entire expedition in Code Veronica is pointless, but she meets up with Chris halfway through. Leon finds Ashley right off the rip in RE4, and we're gonna find the real Chris 3/4 into this fiasco. Really keeps me on my toes when I can't predict how these rescue missions are gonna turn out. But before we can open this door, we have to head into this room to grab a key from Rachel. The corridors leading up to this spot are quite closed in, making the few enemies tossed at you more valid threats. It also helps that Jill shoots at the speed of a 5th grader on Ambien. The used enemy type dispatched here are all the same as the initial encounter in the kitchen, and their function lines up with most unarmed Ganado. They're close quarters enemies, they move slow, and they often just attempt to grab you. Unlike their Spaniard counterpart, they're not so easily knocked down, meaning they can't effectively be used to set up melee attacks in advantageous positions. Instead, they'll be stunned for a few moments when they're damaged beyond a certain threshold. Sometimes they eject their meaty insides for a love tap, but it's not as on command unless you have a specific grenade.
Previously on Resident Evil Revelations. Slow down, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, we're trying to get a look at those biceps. It's like -7 degrees. For Chapter 2-1, we'll kick off the game's decision to bounce around different teams of protagonists. Honestly, not the brightest decision given that one of our teams has the person whom gets new weapons to switch between, gets weapon modifications for customizing loadouts, is rewarded for exploration with tangible items, actually benefits from the game's achievement system, is the one players will want to be because they spend time with the customization system. Meanwhile, these other characters have a fixed weapon set in a game where you can find new weapons, reap no tangible rewards through exploration, invalidate the guns and items you earn in the main campaign since they don't transfer to these people, completely derail you from what you were doing as the character you'd likely want to be, slow down the pace of the main game for mindless action despite this being a return to form for a survival horror, have sections that function worse than raid mode levels since they're interrupted by scripted sequences and cutscenes. Like this chapter we're playing right now. In raid mode, the main segment to this section starts in the caves. You're given waves of enemies and you're more likely to be eager to take them on with your personally customized weapons, which will likely perform far better than the Xanax speed guns Chris has on his person. It's far more personalized action, there's no interruptions, there's multiple difficulties, and you can play it with a friend. Here we have to scan some things to kick off a cutscene, play the first half of the raid mode level with comparatively worse weapons because the game forced us to, then play through a Tomb Raider 2013 segment because somehow restricting my movement and having me sit in place shooting at shit is keeping up with the consoles. This is the far inferior way to experience this sequence of events, and honestly having the game itself as its own comparison makes it much easier to demonstrate this. In summary, one version of the stage slows down what you're doing with cutscenes and scripted events which fight against the very mechanics the game was built for. The equipment you had has arbitrarily been switched out and there's nothing you can do to alter your loadout in a game where weapon customization plays a big role. In the other version of this stage, you get to play it exactly how you want, enemies are remixed for more challenging combat, and it all proceeds without a hitch because you're only doing things the game was designed to do. This is honestly the perfect shorthand example for my thoughts on the game's main campaign versus the raid mode. The multiplayer is honestly just a better version of its single player, because it's free from all the bullshit that AAA game campaigns tend to have. Now Revelations certainly isn't egregiously bad in this regard since you can skip most things, but it still has its moments that unnecessarily slow things down for the sake of it. In summary of the summary, swapping between characters when one was this customizable avatar that was exploring a fully developed map, and the others weren't, was a bad idea. I'm glad they didn't repeat it. Moving on. Well, looks like the creep in the mask took all of our weapons and locked us in a room. Wonder why he didn't kill us. That's the part of the mystery that shouldn't be adding up right now, but my question comes from this gentleman hanging out in the closet. Metaphors aside, did Raymond know this guy was there? I mean, surely he's encountered men infected by T-Abyss by this point. I mean, they're gangbanging every hallway on this piece. You can hardly turn a corner without encountering their fluids. So you'd think if he wanted Jill and Parker to escape, he'd clear the room to make sure it was good. What if this guy just so happened to get out of the closet while Jill is asleep? She should probably be dead by the poor planning here. Thankfully that doesn't happen, and we get to wake up to a calm environment. This is the portion of the game that was released to the 3DS audiences as a demo, so players who tried out Revelations early will know exactly where to go for this section. This chapter was likely chosen as the demo because this is the first point in the gameplay that lines up more with the classic style of Resident Evil. There's a door puzzle, the bottom and top sections of the main cabin to explore, locked doors to encounter, places to search with the Genesis, and enemies to avoid. Playing this, you'd be led into thinking that you were in for an over-the-shoulder version of the classic style of Resident Evil. Yeah, there'd be more storytelling devices used, but Lost in Nightmares was pretty decent, and maybe they expanded that design onto the entire game. I mean, Resident Evil on a cruise liner? It could definitely work. Let's see if that's what we got. I mean, the answer is no, but I'm going to carry on like we haven't answered that question yet. Here, the game will introduce the dodge mechanic, which does not work the way it's instructed. On both versions of the game, you're told to hit a button while pressing forwards or backwards on the control stick, but the button input is entirely unnecessary. All you have to do is be in the initial frames of movement while the enemy is in certain attack animations. No buttons required. You can pull off back-to-back dodges, but eventually the command will just fail. I suspect there's an invisible meter that loses charge after a dodge that will slowly regenerate so long as you don't keep abusing the move. Of all the RE dodge mechanics implemented, I'd say it's the second worst, only passing up the original RE3. It's perfectly functional, but not completely reliable since you can sometimes use it by complete accident, especially on raids with far more enemies. Based on this instruction, I wouldn't be surprised if most people just ended up quick turning, then getting an early prostate exam. The setup to teach the player the mechanic is well done. You're locked in a room with this enemy, disarmed, and you cannot proceed until you've dodged once, but the instructions given here are just flat out wrong. To leave this cabin once we've juked this zombie so hard he breaks his ankle, we need to solve this screwdriver puzzle. I like that it was hidden on the toilet seat as opposed to the tub. Fans of the original RE would definitely expect to find the key item after draining the water. This door puzzle setup will be repeated multiple times throughout the ship, and the objective is just to uncross the wires while lining up the nodes on a powered spot. Conveniently, the gentleman will get out of the TV once you're finished, but he doesn't matter now. While the cabin may reflect the mansion and its atmosphere, there's really only one path to take, as any deviation from that path only leads to bedrooms, bathrooms, or small workspaces. There are some rewards for remembering what was off the beaten path, but once you get the right key, this is definitely not in the same class as the classic RE escapades. Unlike the predecessors, which presented their spaces as one massive puzzle to be worked through chunk by chunk, the cruise liner essentially has you on waypoints until the ship is fully opened, often handing you key items at the beginning or end of each chapter. The old maps also had simplistic layouts with convenient and easy ways to hit each area once you had the majority of spaces unlocked. The maps looped in on themselves, and backtracking for a door that was out of your way never took longer than a minute or so. The ship is far more spread out in its design, having a few focal points of interest which branch off into linear trails. The map does attempt to create some loops of its own, but they're far more spread out. You may have to run to an entirely separate floor or section you don't need to be in at the moment to get to that locked door you may have missed. Thankfully, for a majority of the game's locked spots, you'll be looped near them by the main story about 2/3 of the time. You get 4 major keys which will unlock certain doors, a key card which is given to you once the ship is opened up, and there's a few custom parts scattered off the beaten path. The worst offenders for dragging you way off course of the story come from the saves locked by the Veltro card, the custom part in the flooded bilge, and the optional water purifier room. The reason the level design most often takes this linear approach is likely because all areas have to function as a multiplayer map as well. And not just any multiplayer, Nintendo 3DS multiplayer, a handheld Nintendo didn't intend for people to play for hours and hours on end. A lot of design decisions center around short bursts of play. It's why I suspect the campaign is broken up into much smaller sections than RE4 and RE5, and why the multiplayer is essentially those same short sections of play, never going over an hour at most. These guys weren't making any open-ended maps and RE Outbreak style brain teasers, save one chapter/raid that actually has a more traditional puzzle to work through. All objectives are point A to point B affairs, with enemies along the way, and little room for deviation. There's not much room for anyone to get lost or stray too far away. And it's not until near the end of the game and later raids that most of the ship becomes accessible in a single sitting. Until that point, there's really not much free roaming exploration. It's something you can pick up, play for a few chapters or rounds, then put back down. Something you do while in transit, or taking a shit, or while taking a shit in transit. From the top cabins, you just need to head down to the bottom floor to find Parker. From there, you'll regain your equipment and find your first item customization box. And the more you're able to recall those locked doors you come across earlier, the more you'll have to play around with as long as you progress the campaign. The options for customization don't get as in-depth as they do in multiplayer. You mainly just find custom parts for damage capacity and fire rate, but those options function well enough for the arsenal Jill can acquire. Just an easy way to take a component likely developed for multiplayer and add some flavor to the single player. Once you slap on your first custom part, you simply head back the way you came to reach the elevator since you now have a knife to open the locked door. From there you hit the bridge, someone blows up our little boat stranding us, and then we find this guy. Chapter cleared.
Freeze! Drop the weapon! Drop yours, Parker. Who the hell are you? Dynamite! Dynamite! Previously on Resident Evil Revelations.
You didn't check the ball, Dick! Game point! And you pulled that crap?
What's going on out here?
It was game point, and he didn't check the ball!
You didn't check it up?
Bush League move, bro!
The third chapter is comprised of a flashback segment and the game's first boss encounter on the main trail. The flashback is an action-oriented segment which mirrors one of the game's multiplayer stages, so I'll just skip on past it to our main team. The flashback showed us this weirdo who's an ally of Parker's. We accept his life choices and hatch a plan to make it to the communications room. Around this area is the Helm Key, which begins the game's habit of doling out items which will open up the ship at predetermined points. All classic Resident Evils had an order of significant events, but you could mix up the order of some of the puzzles. For the Zenobia, the events will pretty much pan out the same every time, despite its potential to line up with its predecessors in this regard. The Helm Key will allow us to get the shotgun, and its placement on the map makes it pretty hard to miss, likely intentional since you're going to be fighting your first Skag Dead. Heading through the big double doors grants us entrance to the ship's main hall, one of the best looking areas on the 3DS, especially with the 3D effect. This portion of the ship could have facilitated a map design more in line with the mansion or police station since there are many points that the areas could have connected. You're pretty much set to do a more complex St. Francis Folly with this setup, but it only connects to the cabins, promenade, and casino. Heading towards the first Skag Dead is one of those moments of build-up that I think elevates this section's campaign version over its multiplayer variant. Nothing's interrupting your gameplay, there's some build-up with the items you find, and the faint voice you hear crying out for help steadily gets louder as you find its source. Nothing about it's AAA extra, nothing's blowing up, you're not walking and talking, you're not being scripted out of your movement into a hand job or doing some unrelated portion of gameplay. It's just the game using its cinematic factor to create some tension. The fight itself has some elements from that first Sludge Lord in RE5 when you were trapped in a small space with the furnace. We can go back even further than that and compare these explosive canisters to the one in the sewers of RE4. This setup of having one boss target with some environmental elements to damage it is repeated, but this time there's just more enemies in the mix. The other enemies are definitely there to help curb the easy difficulty of the boss, because without their support it's too slow to catch you and the map allows for too much freedom for it to be a threat. It can one-hit KO you, but it would have to be able to land the hit. There's definitely a line where just throwing in enemies to cover for the boss becomes cheap, but I don't think Revelations ever crosses it. Here you have 2 floors to work with, plenty of time to deal with the other threats, and each threat is attempting to cover the weakness of another without being overbearing. I'd say this is the equivalent of fighting off the unarmed Ganados, melee weapon Ganados, projectile using Ganados, and a chainsaw man. Basically a setup you'd see in RE4. Anyway, once he's dead you get the life buoy key and you're able to hit your objective. Chapter 4 is one of the only one of the 12 not to be divided into any subsections. It essentially mirrors a raid where you run to the area of Rachel's death, find her, then chase her through the initial sections of the boat. The only extra thing the campaign adds is a math puzzle where you throw some coins on a dish to unlock a door that's left open in multiplayer. So nothing the series hasn't seen before, but it lets you breathe after the Skag Dead Bukkake. The following segment in the bilge is the main section of Chapter 5. There are 2 cutaways to resident dork and nerd Keith and Quint for the first and third subsections of this chapter. But like all other cutaways, their sections play out as a strict downgrade to their raid mode counterparts, so I won't keep repeating. Jill's section is definitely most classic RE of the entire ship, housing the only puzzle that involves multiple rooms. I can't really classify other locked doors in the same tier since you're led to all the story-driven points in a controlled manner, and all optional doors are simply for extra content. You need a cog to gain access to the restart key, and you have to gain access to that by flipping the Steam levers. The game will inform you when you've done it correctly, and the solution isn't too complicated since only 2 levers are involved. There's really only 4 combinations to try out, and the spot where the cog is located wasn't so far away that the game should have to tell you that you're good to go. Just let them check it with trial and error. Hell, the Steam gauge is marked with letters. You could have just labeled the exit point where the yellow caution sticker was, so the player could infer the solution. But alrighty then, here you get your first look at sea creepers and shock grenades, something you'll be hesitant to use in the water since you're also standing in the same shit they are, but once you realize that you're not in harm's way of their discharge, they quickly become your best ally for dealing with foes in the water. Fun fact, did you know that all ooze monsters are men, all sea creepers are women, and these Legend of Zelda zombies are walking sharks? 'Cause I didn't. Chapter 6! This is a direct raid mode mission with worse weapons. The point is that Chris and Jessica have arrived on the wrong boat to save Jill and Parker from drowning. They escape on their own, so let's see what they're up to. This is actually the first time proper swimming has shown up in a Resident Evil game. Usually characters just steer clear of that shit entirely, or they just tread in waist-high water. The controls for it are thankfully natural since they just operate on dual analog movement in 3D space. Same way you control like a free camera and a level editor, something like that. It's a little more sluggish than that since there's some weight to the movement, but it's solid. Anyway, we still have to find a method to communicate with HQ, so once we get power going, we have to head to the elevator in the main hall for our second boss fight. The build up here is just some AAA key shaking. The elevator gets dented. A giant fist comes swinging. You shoot it for a little while until you're allowed to proceed up. The fight against the... Fuck me, man. Draghignazo. The fight against the Draghignazo is a direct one-on-one affair. No other assholes in the room to take your attention away from the main target. They probably allowed this since the boss only takes damage in specific areas. You don't have any cover that can't be bulldozed over, and it requires the player to actively dodge. It's not a formula the series hasn't seen before at this point, but the thing's health bar isn't as steep as some of the other similar targets in RE5, which are more amorphous. In multiplayer, once the player gets certain custom parts, they can damage this thing through the armor plating, greatly reducing the difficulty of the encounter, which is good, since they will occasionally show up in clumps. Electric grenades will always damage on contact as well, but by this point in the story on a first playthrough, you are not likely to have too many. So we've just picked up the Veltro keycard at the end of the last chapter, and our goal is to make it up to the deck. The ship is also far more opened up at this point, and we'll have plenty of opportunity in this half of the chapter to take things at our own pace and look around for any extra collectibles or handprints before proceeding. We best do so now because this is the last time we'll be able to do this before we start getting railroaded to the end of the game. Nothing new for Resident Evil, but this is going to be the next 5 chapters. We're essentially going to a lab so we can stop the virus and blow up the final boss. Not without some interruptions along the way, but that's essentially it after this chapter. Once you're done combing the ship for anything you've missed, you have a small firefight on the deck. Winning that kicks off the single player version of the side deck raid, and clearing that kicks off chapter 8 and your return to the casino from an underwater swim. Returning to the casino is the last thing Jill and Parker do as a team, as it's here they reunite with their other halves. How Chris and Jessica got here isn't really important, but we're going to experience it anyway because playing auto-scrolling shooting sections is exactly what I think of when I imagine a return to form for Resident Evil. Maybe it was just to prove that they could do it on the 3DS, Maybe it's just because they thought it would be more cinematic. Maybe it's just because the team just likes these kind of sections, but for whatever reason, we're again just suddenly pulling the player away from the game's central mechanics and the person we'd likely want to be playing as. Your boat moves in a straight line for a set period of time. You shoot shit.
Wow.
Then Chris and Jessica just get teleported to the casino for completing the event. Anyway, we trade partners, and now it's time to make our way to the lab to finish up Chapter 8. Chris has picked up the Trident key for us on the other boat, which works here in the Zenobia since the ships are that identical to one another. You can actually find this door prior to Chris leading you here when the side deck is flooded, but thankfully since the game is on rails at this point, you won't have a chance to wonder if you're supposed to find this key on your own. It'd be a different story if you were able to encounter this door when you're just exploring the fully open Zenobia. Jill will find a fingerprint scanner, which is more interactive on the 3DS. Then you and your partner split up for a 1v1 against the land shark. Though it's really more like Chris yelling and his inability to help while you take care of business. Again, this split is far more endearing in multiplayer, where both people will be tasked to kill the same enemy, and the one who kills theirs first can go assist their teammate. Chapters 9 and 10 are pretty straightforward, with 9 being a more puzzle-heavy version of a raid stage, and 10 hitting its multiplayer counterpart near identically, save for the part where we slow down to help Parker. There's really not much left to say about the content on offer here. It's not terribly complex and functions as intended. But we gotta keep stretching things out, so we'll also cut away to a dork and his nerd and a whore and her gentleman to play out their respective versions of multiplayer stages. Chapters 11 and 12 is where the single player mostly deviates from the multiplayer. Mostly. We kick things off with what looks like the end of most Resident Evil games. We're tasked with killing off a giant virus-ridden monster before finishing the job with the staple rocket launcher. The battle on the ground essentially plays like the Excella fight from Resident Evil 5. The stage layout is nearly identical, and you're trying to shoot tentacle weak points until you're handed a rocket launcher. Of the two, I would say this variation is far easier since there's less stage hazards and the boss mostly has simplistic attacks which are easy to avoid. Unlike the Excella fight, we've got a second phase to clear, which is another on-rail shooter using similar mechanics to the boat Chris and Jessica use. You point and shoot at the tentacles while fending off its attacks until it's time for the finisher. I wasn't a fan of this concept when it was introduced in RE5, since it's just mindless shooting, even more so than some of the franchise's other indulgences up to this point, and I'm still not really a fan of it here. At least when you're on foot, you can use positioning, the environment, or the enemies themselves to make an intelligent attack. Thankfully, this isn't the final boss, it's just another set piece along the way. Before we can get to the actual final boss, we have one more flashback in Terra Grigia to work through, so let's just look at the 19th raid stage. Stage 19 has you work your way from the stairwell to the main office, from the starting point of another Terra Grigia raid, where you then head to the roof. It's one of the stages that will allow your duo to split up for efficiency. One can head up the stairwell to clear out all the enemies, which will be required for the final onslaught to trigger near the front office. The other can just carve out a path for their teammate in advance so that they can make the return trip to the elevator far more easily. I enjoy the stages which allow for this type of splitting up more so than the strict linear paths of the earlier stages, since replaying these raids can be a rotation of different experiences each time instead of the exact same one. The chasm and trench difficulty level will keep the enemies to mostly hunters, since that's the enemy type the story provides, while Abyss will throw its usual curveballs while ooga boogaing you at the end with more enemies than the lower difficulty levels. Now look, I get it. I know I throw around the word bukake around like the common whore sucks dick, but I truly mean it when I say the Abyss onslaught at the end of this stage upon going for that genocide is by all definitions of the word an enemy bukake. Your eyes will be sealed closed by the sheer number of monsters just non-stop coming at you. That wetsuit is going to be stiff as cardboard. You probably have an STD. You're going to need that tricked out weapon. Now on to the story mode end of things. Imagine this stage, exact same layout. You're going to be taking the genocide route, but like slower because you're babysitting Raymond. Fucking Jessica won't be reenacting any Hitomi Jacob scenes at the end of it either. But with the last flashback out of the way, it's time for our final chapter, which, sans the final boss room, is completely unique territory to the story. The underwater section is just stealth as you encounter the globsters you fought on land underwater. Turns out they're far more agile and deadly with these conditions, so you just have to wait for them to swim by so you can press onwards. Nothing really spectacular about the section. Except maybe the music. Inside the Queen Dido is some nice atmosphere, but not really much to do but watch a cutscene and head to the final boss room. So let's just wrap things up with the Norman fight, which for all intents and purposes is just Tyrant with more powers to compensate for the player's improved shooting mechanics. He takes a lot of damage, has a large weak point on his back along with a smaller one on his heart, which should be targeted at all times. I think what he's doing when he duplicates himself for this attack is causing the player to hallucinate, which is why firing on the real one shakes off the effect. In order to avoid the attacks from his duplication jutsu, you just have to damage the one vomiting purple gas. When he's lunging at you, the telegraphing is the same, you just have to hit the weak point to halt the attack. Thankfully, the game realizes that you're using multiplayer weapons on melatonin, and will thus likely require more firearms than you're holding. An item chest is just hanging out in the room, and Norman will be kind enough to let you stop by and grab whatever gun you want, move whatever custom parts you need, and then carry on. But this definitely damages the pace of the fight, and is the only time a final boss in Resident Evil has had to make this kind of concession just to function correctly for a first time playthrough. This likely has to do with the 3 weapon limit and the way ammo drops in the room work. See, in multiplayer, you'll only find ammo drops for the weapons you physically have on your person. So if you only take a handgun, all ammo cases will exclusively drop handgun ammo. If you take 2 weapons, you only find ammo for those 2 weapons, and so on. Here the game has ammo drops in the room, but it could be for any of the weapons you found, in which Jill can have up to all 5 types by this point. The pistol, shotgun, magnum, machine gun, and sniper. The ammo drops in the room could be for any one of those 5 types, so if the item box were left outside the boss room, and Jill just so happened to choose the wrong weapons, she could be left using her knife by the end of the fight. This is exacerbated by the fact that she could also have a rocket launcher as well, taking up another weapon slot. No other Resident Evil game had this problem. 1 through Code Veronica just required your big boy firearms in the end. 4 allowed you to carry all of your weapons, and 5 did not restrict the amount of firearms you had. You also potentially had a partner helping you through the fight. Leaving the item box in the room is a solution, but it's also very clunky. So to fix it, I would tie the ammo drops to the specific weapons the player had on their person, and then provide the amount the player needed in the corners of the room. Like, some wood boxes. Maybe use some of that AAA cash to have Norman damage the stage, exposing some more ammo as the fight went on. If we absolutely had to have other guns, we could have some of the multiplayer exclusive weapons drop here with a full ammo reserve. Maybe when Norman's at like half health, he rants about the education system, or Creed or some shit. Then he breaks one of the side columns where the Drake was stashed. Then Jill just trades off her empty gun and presses on. It's a good fight grounded in the game's main combat mechanics, that works better in multiplayer, but getting to pause like this is too clunky a way to handle things in the story mode.
This is how Morgan treats his friends.
Let's do this.
Us. That's a form of
Racism, some would say, in their own language.
Now we get to the meat and potatoes of Revelations. What I would like to call the de facto multiplayer experience for the Resident Evil series. Raid mode. This includes Revelations 2 as well if we axe what is possibly the most insane grindfest I've ever experienced. I'm just talking about the core setup here. Up until now, we've had Extreme Battle, the Battle Game, the Mercenaries, Tofu Survivor. Hell, we've had a full-on Mercenaries game. This component right here is what I would argue is the series' strongest showing for multiplayer with this over-the-shoulder style. If we're talking classic RE multiplayer, then Outbreak still has my vote. Instead of Mercenaries' small crop of stages with the goal to keep killing as long as possible, we have point A to point B objectives with the option to not kill everything if we can't hack it. This was also true of Extreme Battle and the Mercenaries mode of RE3, but the concept is far more fleshed out here. If you couldn't already tell from my constant mention of multiplayer throughout the single player, Raid mode, for all intents and purposes, is just allowing you to experience the single player with a friend. Only you have the add-ons of better equipment, more enemies, and no cutscenes. No reason to cover the raids individually at this point, so let's go about this in more general terms, starting with our cast of characters. Like in multiplayer's past, each character has something about them which helps to make them unique. Before, this was achieved with giving each schlub their own personal loadout and occasionally their own close quarters animations. This time around, each character can choose whatever weapons they like. However, some will have natural abilities which will benefit specific weapons, steering you to using that weapon. There are passive skills as well, but most characters will have something or other that leads them to using specific loadouts. It's the game's way of encouraging you to change up your character, though using a favorite while sacrificing the skills isn't really that big of a deal, especially in the late game where most of the weapon-specific skills are negated by a rare custom part. Because marketing told Shinji Mikami once that leveling systems are addictive, Revelations tacks it on here in the form of weapon levels and character levels. Unlike certain other games, Revelation wisely leaves character level as a universal stat, allowing you to swap between the cast without consequence. But, like any other game with levels attached to them, all they do is artificially extend playtime, artificially lock content, and modify damage. The character leveling is honestly a little pointless, and the weapon customization system could have substituted the weapon level system for a far more focused experience. You already have damage mods, fire rate mods, reloading mods, ancillary effect mods, and passive buffs. On top of that, there's already a system for increasing each weapon stat on the gun. So instead of having like the level 50 handgun, why not just the handgun that you can buff 30 times in whatever way you want, and mod with custom parts? You can still differentiate weapon drops with the passive effects and number of custom slots, and then you can just tweak enemy health to more precise values across all raids since you know the upper and lower limits of each weapon more conclusively. So the 20 base stages are split into 3 different difficulties with levels tied to them. But the thing that makes them more difficult is not that the enemy's number is higher, it's that there's more of them, the types which appear are more challenging, and they move quicker. If you play everything in order at level, you'll find a gradual difficulty increase that's not too sudden. More than likely, you're going to play things at level the first time through, so all the levels are doing is effectively just locking content just because. There's literally no harm in just letting someone play through the raid mode stages in order without repeats. None. Zero. If the issue is that we don't want the player to be too overpowered on a first encounter, then just give all the weapons mediocre base stats. Have the player gradually unlock the ability to buff weapons, and limit what custom parts you give out. You can have it so players can only buff their weapon stats 10 times until Chasm is cleared. Then let them do it up to 20 until Trench is cleared. Then allow the full 30 when they get to Abyss. For custom parts, just do the same shit, split up how they're dropped into thirds between the 3 difficulties. I mean, pretty sure you're already doing it. Another way of saying it, Mercenaries mode had this aspect right. You don't need a freaking level system to flesh something out, and you already had another unique system to work with. I didn't end up covering the target practice in the game earlier, so let's have a gander at what we're shooting. On 3DS we have 17 enemies, and we have 18 for the port. But we know we can't have separate but equal animals in this joint. We don't see color here, only functionality. And functionally, I'd say we have 16 for the 3DS and 17 for the port. We kind of, sort of have a duplicate for the Hunter, but since one can turn invisible, I'd say that's enough of a distinction. Revelations actually did a really good job of making sure things didn't overlap with one another, and pretty much everything is filling its own niche. The Ooze is just an unarmed Ganado. The Pincer Ooze is just a Ganado with an axe. The Tricone Ooze is the Ganado that throws shit at you. And the Chunk Ooze is that Alu Akbar brother that was gonna sacrifice it all to put a dent in Leon's health bar. Unlike their RE4 counterparts, you can't trip them up as easily to get in for hand-to-hand, and that's probably due to how the Zenobia is set up. Like, imagine running down the halls and seeing an Ooze around the corner and just being like, yeah, nah, I'm okay. For the more open environments of 4 and the higher enemy counts, having an easily accessed context-sensitive attack makes a lot of sense. Here, the more enclosed spaces, we'll get through this. Here, with the more enclosed spaces, we want the enemies to be a little bit more threatening. So to gain access to our melee attack, we either need to cross a damage threshold, or use a specific grenade. Thankfully, using melee still stuns other nearby Ooze monsters, but melee isn't as prominent as an option as it was in RE4. Globsters are pretty much condemned to wander this beach for the rest of their natural lives unless we're talking about a few select other situations. They're big, slow, hulking targets with a one-hit KO they can nail you with. They have a weak point, and they're mainly paired with themselves. It's really not common to see them mixed in with other enemies, and I really can't think of why. The slow speed and imminent threat of instant death would pair well in moderation with other enemies. The other instant death machines set traps or move really fast, so it's not like it overlaps too much. Not again! Then we have the dogs returning for the small, agile target role. The hunters come back as an agile, human-sized target with stronger attacks. One of them turns invisible, but the aiming reticule will reveal them. Like the dogs, they have no defense against attacks to make up for their speed. The fish are just kinda little pests that do chip damage on land and stronger chip damage in the water. They basically share the same role as the wolves, but in the water. The sea creepers are exclusive to water and will try to drown you. They stop your movement, drag you down, and do damage at the same time. Women, am I right?
Totally patriarchal.
The Scarmaglions will block attacks and split into 2 separate attacking modes when damaged enough in the area they're not protecting. Initially, they start off slow to counteract their better defense, but once that's stripped, they'll either be a walking pair of legs with an electric spine and they'll just walk at you, and that walk is basically a nightmare if they have the speed stat, or they'll just be a torso on the ground that will lunge at you. These land sharks are honestly some of the most creative enemies the team has come up with. The wall blisters are port exclusive, one-hit KO machines. They come out of their shell, yell a racial slur, then just run at you with the intention of twisting your spine. They have no defense and are quite easy to put down, but they apply some immediate pressure and are a good mix with the other types in moderation. I already talked about the Skagdad, Drigagnazo, Malakota, and Norman.
Blast him!
Not so much on Rachel. Remember Nemesis? Well, imagine him with boobs.
Who here just thought of
Nemesis?
with boobs? Really? I'm the only one? Yes! He must never know.
She doesn't shoot at you or anything. She's just a walking contradiction that Ooze enemy types are male exclusive. But she's just basically a really tough Ooze. She just wants to give you a hug, and you really have to convince her not to. All the enemies have a standard set of behaviors which are played straight in the single player, but in raid mode they can have several modifiers. You can usually tell when an enemy is modded since their size usually reflects the change, and they also have that big sign next to their level. These mods are pretty standard. They either hit harder, take more bullets, move way faster, or have all 3 applied to some degree. The one that makes the biggest impact is definitely speed on the Abyss difficulty when enemies have access to their full potential. You ever chase a hunter on meth? Cause fuck that. But yeah, Revelations has a great enemy lineup. A lot of them pair well in groups and there's virtually no overlap with their roles. They're all filling some kind of niche, which is what makes for a good shooter. Now, I could go back and cover some raids which were tied to the story mode chapters I skipped, those being the ones which focused on characters other than Jill. But the raids are basically arena shooters with different enemy combinations. The only ones which don't fit that category are the Terra Grigia raids. But Snowy Mountain, arena to arena to arena. Snowy Mountain 2, trek to the arena. Airstrip, trek to the arena. The only raid worth touching on this point is Ghost Ship, since it's pretty much its own challenge, not parallel to anything in the main story. We've already covered that the 3DS version will allow you to bail out at certain points across the map, while the HD ports will function like every other raid, with one endpoint. I don't think the 3DS concept had to be completely nuked to make Ghost Ship work better for cooperative play. I would have just kept all the endpoints in single player, and then removed them in multiplayer to dissuade farming. The endpoints were set up that way due to the way enemies scale throughout the ship, beginning with very low stats before gradually becoming stronger. It's an indication of how far along you are in the raid, and you know every time you see one that things are going to ramp up a little more. It does so by starting with standard enemies blocking the path, blocking you in specific areas with different enemy combos, sub-boss fights, then eventually throwing you in back-to-back cage matches with that number 5 Bukake combo on the ship's deck. This is the only time in the game that the level system is used this creatively, but I still think this could have worked by just spreading stats between the 18 enemies, having generally weaker enemies on the front end, then ramp it up on the back. The raid itself is massive and has a little puzzle element going on for folks trying to hit the genocide bonus. A vast majority of this ship, including the endgame areas, are accessible, but in order to touch each room once, you need to navigate things in a specific order. Otherwise, you can lock yourself out completely from certain rooms. I believe the only part of the ship you don't end up traversing are the hallways leading up to Rachel. It's the one raid that, when played in full, will borderline require you to have these special custom parts to complete, due to how little ammo is distributed. Not impossible, but being able to draw on your entire ammo reserve with Gluttony, as opposed to only your selected set, makes a world of difference. Ammo drops are randomized, so if the game keeps handing out bullets for weapons you're not using at the moment, well, pants around ankles, ass in front of glory hole, and wait to get poked in the no-no square. Since the machine gun has the highest ammo reserves in the game, I would choose 2 weapons to actually use and just have it on hand as an ammo generating machine. When my other weapons ran dry, the first ammo stash they stole from was the machine gun. With the combination of a custom part generating bullets every so often, and finding 30 rounds at a time here and there, Ghost Ship became far more manageable to genocide. This is sadly the only time that those type of ammo generation custom parts get to have their shine, as you're not really going to have any other situations where you need to literally be spawning ammo just to get by. But as a finale event, Ghost Ship is a great raid, given that you have the hour of time to set aside for working towards one goal.
Blah! That's a real reference.
For the first official foray into handheld territory, Revelations is a competent little modern RE experience. Its multiplayer is definitely the stronger of its 2 suits, as it can be quite the addicting experience. Compared to RE4 and RE5's campaign, Revelations is pretty modest, and I wouldn't seek it out over the prior entries to the series. Can't master a set environment with puzzles that can be done in several orders, doesn't compare to the creativity and inventiveness of RE4 remotely, and RE5 fully committed to the multiplayer campaign to the point where it was like a detriment not having a second person to play along with. It's a game best taken in bite sizes as it was packaged as. Hop in, play for a little bit, then hop out. If you're going to go the long haul, having a friend along for the ride in multiplayer helps. If you're going to go for the U-Haul, get insurance, because they won't care if you lose all the tires on the projects.